This is a camera. And this is a camera. So if you can take a picture with this little cell phone camera, why would you lug around this great big DSLR? Hi, I'm Dan Davis. Welcome to my photo studio. That's Kendall. She's my assistant today. Everyone these days is carrying a camera in their hip pocket, packaged in a cell phone. More people are taking more pictures than ever before, but we're losing the craft of photography. After all, if all you have to do is point and shoot, why learn f-stops and shutter speeds? Even though the point and shoot phenomenon dumbs down our knowledge of photography, the proliferation of cameras has sparked a widespread interest in the art of photography. On Photography Gone Digital, we're going to introduce you to the world of photography that exists beyond your camera phone. In today's episode, we're going to Skype an interview with a leading sports photographer from Australia and learn how to capture world-class action shots like these. Then later in the show, I'll introduce you to a photographer who has combined traditional print development techniques with high-tech digital capture to create hauntingly beautiful landscapes. But first, let's lay the foundation for understanding basic photography. My local camera shop puts on seminars. You know what the most popular subject is? How do you use the M setting on your digital camera? M means manual. After this episode, you're not going to be afraid of the M anymore. There are many situations when the auto exposure modes give you a bad picture. You need to know how to control the settings manually to get the shot you're after. Using the camera in the manual mode is Photography 101. Shutter, f-stop, ISO. Shutter, f-stop, ISO. You need to know how to control these three functions to get just the right exposure. At the end of this episode, you'll get it. The shutter is like a curtain. The aperture, or f-stop setting, is like a window. And the ISO is a specification of light sensitivity we assign to the film, or in the case of digital photography, the sensor. In the manual mode, we control the curtain or shutter with a speed setting, the window or aperture with a size setting, we call that the f-stop, and the sensitivity of the sensor with the ISO setting. The shutter is in the camera body, directly in front of the sensor. The longer the shutter is open, the more light hits the sensor. The aperture is the window we control with size settings. The bigger the window, the more light it lets in. In a DSLR, it's not in the camera, it's in the lens. Now, ISO. ISO is easier. You can dial up or down the sensitivity of the sensor. The bigger the ISO number, the more sensitive the sensor becomes. When we get the correct combination of shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO, we've exposed a picture correctly. Now let's go deeper. Besides correct exposure, there are other consequences to your choice of shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO. Let's look at those. First, back to shutter speed. See how the length of time the shutter is open affects the appearance of moving subjects? One 500th of a second can freeze subjects that are moving at a moderate speed. See? Understanding shutter speed is critical to shooting fast-moving subjects. Our special guest today is going to show us how he uses shutter speed in shooting sports. Cameron Spencer shoots for Getty Images. He's covered the last 5 Olympic Games and countless other international sporting events. Let's go to the computer and say hi. Hi Cameron, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, great to be here.
Cameron, what was your career path that led you to the 2016 Olympics in Rio?
In 2004, I got an opportunity to become a star photographer with Getty, and so I've been photographing sport ever since 2004, full time. I've been to 5 Olympics, and I've done a handful of World Cups, lots of Grand Slam tennis.
What is your strategy for covering such a massive event?
Getty Images had around 35 photographers shooting sport. I had to prepare myself and my equipment and think about what I was covering in terms of what lenses I needed for what events at the track and field, way before it started. You want to be ready, you want to be on your game just like the athletes are, and, peak when you're there and make sure you don't miss a thing. And there's a lot of pressure and it's really stressful when you don't get much sleep. But I think everyone just seems to be in it together and you pull through, and the reward is great imagery.
What do you carry in your camera bag for shooting sports?
I had 3 Canon 1DX Mark II cameras, and then, the main lenses that you use day to day are, 24 to 70 mil lens, a 16 to 35 mil lens, and then the lens we call the workhorse, which is the 70 to 200 mil lens.
Really?
Use that probably more than any lens, but then with sport, because you're not allowed on the field of play the majority of the time, you need a good telephoto lens. So my go-to lens is, when I'm inside the track, I always use the 300 mil f2.8. And when I'm outside the track, it's usually, for heats, I usually use a 600 mil lens.
In most sports photography, you have to really try and stop the action. What are your typical camera settings?
You want to be able to crank the camera up enough to shoot at a fast enough shutter to freeze the action. And I find with most sport these days, you need to be shooting at least, a 12/50th or 1600th of a second. At night, if you're at f2.8 at 1/1600, you need to be on usually 3200 ISO, 4000 ISO. So it's pretty big ISO.
Isn't it amazing that you can take a picture at 4000 ISO and the results be a publishable shot?
Oh, it's unbelievable, yeah.
We live in a world where photo editing is done so routinely now, most people don't even trust what they see in pictures anymore. What are the rules for manipulating photos in the world of photojournalism?
With anyone who works in media, shooting editorial photography, you sort of abide by something called, the code of ethics, which is editorial integrity. And basically that means you're not allowed to manipulate a picture at all. You have to do basic corrections to an image only. Anything more than that, and I'll lose my job. That's how serious it is. So if I clone out, say, an empty Coke can that's in the corner of my picture, and I think it ruins the picture, if I cloned that out, I'd get sacked. I think that's what makes photographing sport so exciting, because to get a perfect picture is so rare.
Shooting the Olympics must be just a grueling gig. How many pictures did you bring home?
I would have been shooting for at least 21 days, and I know that when I got home, I had a hard drive with 45,000 images on it just from the Olympics. 10% of those would be publishable, but I'd say out of that, I'd say probably only 3% were published.
Of those 45,000 images, let's look at 2. Freezing action that happens too fast for the eye to see. That's the wonderful thing about fast shutter speeds. This shot of high jumper Dmitry Kreuter allows us to see an instant in time that illuminates the nature of an athletic competition. What were your camera settings for this shot?
Yeah, I remember that day that it was, pretty bright, and I think in order to not get movement with the subject, I was shooting a 1600th pretty much all the time when I was photographing high jump, just to really freeze them as they went over the bar.
This shot of Usain Bolt is a great example of the creative use of shutter speed for dramatic effect. Tell us about this very iconic shot from the 2016 Rio Olympics.
Yeah, so the Usain Bolt picture for me is probably career changing, and it was a great image to get, and I'm pretty excited that it happened. But you know, it wasn't a fluke. It sort of was years of photographing Usain Bolt, and you know, I'd photographed him at all 3 Olympics, and at 2 World Championships, and at a Commonwealth Games. So, and I had an idea in mind to shoot a pan shot, so I was going to shoot at a slow shutter speed and pan him going past me. And the idea was to show a sense of speed as he kind of passed the camera, and you know, anywhere between about a 40th and a 60th would be, you know, a great sort of shutter speed to shoot at, to get a nice blur in the background and even a bit of movement, you know, in his legs and his hands. And, you know, the slower you go, the riskier it is. And I wanted to take a risk. I ran straight to my laptop that was at the finish line and downloaded the card that went straight to editors. And they moved that picture within about 2 minutes. It was on news desks around the world.
Well, Cameron, I'm so glad you spent some time with us today. You gave us some great tactics on photographing sports. Where are you off to next?
Yeah, so my next big event is the Australian Open Tennis, which starts in a few days, and that's a grueling 2 weeks of long days. You know, you're there all day, you're there all night, you're in the sun, but, you know, it's one of only 4 Grand Slams in the world, and it makes for incredible images every time I go down. And I think this will be my 12th one to photograph, so I'm pretty excited about it.
Thanks a bunch for your time.
No worries. Thanks, Darren. I appreciate it.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Cheers. See ya.
So, high ISO settings allow super fast shutter speeds, plus the right equipment, and take a lot of shots. Thanks, Cameron. You taught us a lot about shooting sports. You can see the complete conversation with Cameron on our website and learn even more about the world of editorial photography. Before we move on to understanding f-stop, a caution about using slow shutter speeds. If your shutter is set too slow, you can get an unintended effect, and that's an image that looks something like this, kind of fuzzy. That's unwanted camera motion. I do everything I can to stabilize the camera using a tripod, a monopod, or just leaning against something solid. Try this little exercise. Take a series of pictures of an item, an object, with a lot of detail. Change your shutter speed from, say, 1/10 of a second up to 250th of a second, and see how steady your hand is. Open the images and inspect them on your computer. Look at them closely for camera motion. See how slow you can go and still get a sharp image. The image sensors in modern DSLRs can be cranked up to such high ISO numbers, you can now take pictures under extremely low light conditions, creating a whole category for creativity and experimentation. See what kind of portrait you can make with just the light of a cell phone. Now let's look at how f-stop choice affects your image. So if the curtain represents the shutter in your camera, the aperture acts as an adjustable window in the lens of your camera. It's the second way we control the amount of light that hits the sensor. The f-stop scale looks like this. Lots of choices. Whereas the shutter setting is a duration, the aperture is a choice of, well, iris or f-stop or hole size. Interchangeable terms. As the f number on the scale gets bigger, the iris size gets smaller. I know that's counterintuitive, but it will make sense later on. So aperture gives you the ability to adjust the amount of light hitting the sensor. It also affects depth of field. You've heard of that term before. It means that part of the image that is in apparent focus. Kendall is going to demonstrate. As the f-stop number gets bigger, two things happen. The aperture hole gets smaller and the depth of field gets deeper. Watch as more faces come into apparent focus as I click down the f-stop. Now let's step outside and see how controlling depth of field will improve the portraits you take. Compare the background on these two images. Which do you like better? The out of focus background on this one helps this portrait a lot, I think. Sets the subject apart. See how the background on the other one here is distracting. Here's a new word for you. Use it to impress your friends. Bokeh. Bokeh is the aesthetic quality of the blur produced in the out of focus parts of an image. So now we understand shutter speed and f-stop, both technically and creatively. Let's see how these two settings are related to each other. For any given scene that you want to photograph, there are many different combinations of shutter speed and f-stop that allows the right amount of light to hit the sensor. Let me show you. Remember our little friend here? She's going to demonstrate the simple relationship between f-stop and shutter speed. I have the camera on a tripod in the manual mode with the ISO set at 1000. Let's select 1/15 of a second as our starting shutter speed. The meter indicates that I have to match that with an f-stop of 10 to get a correct exposure. Now watch this. When I speed up the shutter by one click and open up the aperture by one click, the exposure stays constant. Watch the indicator. In fact, I can move one click at a time right through the f-stop and shutter speed range and maintain a correct exposure. That's because there's a 1-to-1 ratio between shutter speed and f-stop. A simple EV chart will illustrate this in another way. For any light level, there are lots of f-stop shutter speed combinations that will give you a correct exposure. A modern light meter shows this relationship. Take a reading, then click through the range to see which combination suits your creative objectives. Are you more interested in controlling depth of field or speed? Remember, f-stop controls depth of field. As you close down the f-stop, the aperture gets smaller, the numbers get bigger, and the depth of field gets deeper. If controlling movement is your priority, remember, freezing the action is achieved with faster shutter speeds. Now you get it. F-stops, shutter speeds, and ISO. Practice, practice, practice. Resist the temptation to use the automatic settings on your camera. The more you shoot in manual mode, the more you'll understand photography. It's that simple. So have fun. All right, go ahead, just bring it back when you're done. Well, how about a road trip? There's a professional photographer in northern Michigan who spent his whole life in all types of photography. Let's go meet him.
Photostock began 11 years ago now, and it began rooted in kind of the fear of losing our materials back in the day. Analog photography was quickly shifting over to digital photography, and there were a lot of us that had gotten into a photographic forum that was based for people that used film, analog photographers. And I put out an offer to come up here one summer to have a little gathering out in the woods. I told people to bring their tents or sleeping bags, and I didn't know who was going to come. And about 14 or 15 people showed up, and we had a great time. And One of the guys there, his name's Dan Henderson, a good friend of mine now. He was at the first one, and he said, boy, this is just like Woodstock for photographers, and that's where the idea of Photostock came in. So I've done it every year ever since.
Bill, Emmett County, Michigan is a long way from New York City, and even Detroit. Tell me about a career in photography that has led you to this beautiful, somewhat remote part of the world.
I got into photography at a real early age. My family, I had a great-grandfather back in the turn of the century that had a photo studio in Detroit. And so there was always a lot of camera gear around when I was a kid, and I got into it pretty heavily. So when it came time to college, you know, I went off to Central Michigan University, got a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in photography, and that pretty much began it all. I went to New York and started to work for a photographer there by the name of Alan McQueenie. That taught me a lot about the commercial business, and I came back to Detroit, set up my own commercial business, and the rest is what it is now. You know, I've worked for magazines all over, Time, Newsweek, Fortune. I've had work in Rolling Stone, Spin, done a lot of rock and roll work, corporate editorial work, annual reports. I've shot presidents, I've shot movie stars. It's, you know, it's been an amazing road, actually.
You describe an early career in photography that most would envy, shooting the best, the brightest, the most beautiful. Now as I look at your subjects, I don't see a single person.
In my career working with people and working in the editorial field and working with high-profile people, like you say, that was done more as a means to an end. That was a way to make a living for me. And that was the way to a more lucrative living than what I am doing now with the landscape. But as you said, it was very high stress, and there was a lot of anxiety involved with that. There was a lot of pressure on you to do that, and I did that for many years, and I'm just really not interested in doing that at all anymore.
Up till now, you've shot most of your landscapes in black and white. What draws you to black and white photography?
My images in black and white were more about that singular image, and they were more about composition and contrast and feeling and mood and things like that. Whereas with the color work, I'm using that more to free me up and to be able to tell more of a story with it. My photographs over the years were more involved in just that. They were more conveyance of my feelings, of my inner feelings, that kind of a thing, a mood, what have you. But with the color work that I've been doing, I've been more interested in telling a story that's outside of me.
What subjects do you like to shoot?
Whether or not I'm shooting in black and white or color, I always like to shoot at night. And the way that I've done this in the past is when I was shooting in black and white, it was very simple because black and white films are fast, they're very graphic, light and dark, positive, negative space works really well at night. But what I found in shooting color digitally at night is it opens up the possibilities so much more for me. And I'm able to, because of the modern sensors in the cameras now, I'm able to capture a huge range of light at night that I wasn't able to before.
What are the unique challenges to shooting at night?
The basics of photography are that you need a lot of time. So you've got to shoot a longer time exposure to gather more light because there's less light to expose your film. So in doing that, you have to hold the camera very still. So you're definitely going to have to put your your camera on a tripod. You're definitely going to have to use some sort of a shutter release so that you're not touching your camera and shaking it. You're definitely going to have to do some things where point sources of light will expose your film too fast, so you maybe want to hide those point sources of light behind a corner, behind a wall, or maybe behind a tree, something like that. Another thing that really works well with night photography is in the wintertime in a city when there's a lot of snow on the ground and the ambient light reflects back up into the sky and it becomes just like a big giant softbox.
What are your typical camera settings?
Exposure for a nighttime photograph varies quite a great deal depending on what your ISO setting is on your digital camera or what the ISO of the film is that you're using. But basically you're going to want to use something in that 400 ISO range, and in doing that you're going to get, in a bright ambient city night, you're going to get an exposure of anywhere maybe between 5 and 10 seconds for an exposure.
Bill, you founded an event, an annual gathering of photographers, the purpose of which, among other things, is to keep alive traditional photographic development techniques.
Oh yeah, and primarily that's what they've been in the past. The event grew out of analog photography. I started it back 11 years ago as part of an analog photographic website where people were going that shot analog. They were afraid of losing their materials in the digital with the advent of the digital world. So yeah, a lot of it began in that. So there'll be tintype processes, and we'll do photogravure processes, and we'll do all different kinds of things, platinum, palladium, all things that were done in the 19th, early 20th century. In fact, one of the processes that people at Photostock like to work in is the platinum palladium process, which is a process where you take noble metals of platinum and palladium and you mix them with ferric oxalate, a light-sensitive solution, and then you coat a piece of paper with it, and then you've made your own piece of photographic paper, and then you take a negative and you lay it on that and make an exposure. And that's actually what I'm working on right now, and I'd like to give you a demonstration if you'd like to see it. The palladium process starts with getting a nice piece of watercolor paper, and then what I'm going to do is create my own emulsion to coat it with. And then I'm going to evenly start to coat it. This part is where I marry the 19th century with the 21st century here, where I've made a digital negative through my computer from an original scan of a piece of film that was shot. Put the negative onto the emulsion. We take it and we put it inside the UV burner. I'm going to develop it in a bath of potassium oxalate. And you can see there's a bit of a latent image already burned in there. Watch what happens when I pour the developer on. There it is. And that's it.
In your long career, you've experienced the transition from film photography to digital. What is your assessment of the impact of digital on our line of work?
Digital has definitely changed the world of photography in good ways and in bad ways. But in the long run, it's tended to be in good ways, because what it's done is it's brought a lot more people into it, which in the beginning seemed to be one of the bad points. But it really does. In the whole collective human race right now, I think that we create more pictures in one day than we did in the whole 20th century. So, you know, that's a good thing in a way. But it also tends to be a bad thing because it's, in a way, it's sort of devalued photography. Because everybody thinks that, you know, Uncle Charlie can shoot their wedding, and that, you know, the reporter at the local newspaper can make a great Pulitzer Prize winning photograph, which just isn't the case, because a true photographer and somebody who's been really educated in photography knows where to tell a story and knows how to tell a story and knows how to work that camera, knows how to do things and rely less on gimmickry and filters, say, in Instagram or something like that. Now, I don't want it to seem like I'm speaking of that derogatorily, because I've really embraced it in my own work quite a bit. I have a very active Instagram account. I love using it. I think it's a great tool. And just like everything in this business, whereas once digital seemed like almost the enemy to me as an analog photographer, now I embrace it as just another tool in my bag, and it's really opened up the world even further to us as photographers.
Bill also brings his unique vision to the use of drone photography, the latest tool he has added to his tool bag. Check out what a drone can do in the hands of a master photographer. Remember, if you want to become a great photographer, study the work of great photographers. That's what we do each episode of Photography Gone Digital. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.